Hi, dear Ed. You are one of the most important people, objectively talking, in the work to build up a interfaith dialogue and, in a broader sense, an intercultural dialogue among specifically among Jews, Muslims, Christians, and of course, as far as I understand, the quinta essence of the Wolf Institute that you are one of the builders in Cambridge University. The core is to expand, to project this dialogue to all the beliefs, all the cultures. So my first question is, how did you come to this passion for dialogue, for building up a bridge? My subconscious betrayed me, because pontifice in Spanish or in Latin is that the work of the Pope is to build up bridges, puentes, ponte in Italian. To build up bridges among different beliefs, different cultures. How began this passion?
Well, thank you, Abraham, and your words are far too kind about my contribution. But how did it all begin? I guess there's a personal encounter and there's the educational encounter, because I believe the dialogue requires both. On the personal, I went to university to study Hebrew in England. And I took a year off and I was spending time in Israel on a gap year. I came back to England, and because of the cuts under Margaret Thatcher, the university closed its Hebrew department. But they'd accepted me to study Hebrew, so they put me in the Department of Theology. And I was the only Jew in the Department of Theology. And I was surrounded by all these Christians. And it was my personal encounter with these Christians, some of whom were training to go into the church. And I realized I was learning as much about myself in my encounter with them as they were learning about me or my religion. And it was that personal encounter. But on the educational side, which is as important as the personal, it was when I came to Cambridge and I was undertaking a PhD on the Akedah, the binding of Isaac in Jewish and Christian thought, the terrible story in Genesis 22 about God commanding Abraham to sacrifice his son. You know it very well. And it's a story that's central to both Jews and Christians. It's read in the period leading up to Easter, and it's read on Rosh Hashanah. And in the study of that story, I began to see the interaction between Jewish and Christian commentators in Midrash Rabbah, in the church fathers, in the classical traditions of our respective religions. And academically, I suddenly realized there was an encounter that had gone on for hundreds of years after the New Testament closed, after the life and death of Jesus, after the early church fathers. So I learned both academically, if you like, and educationally, and I learned both personally that I understood more about myself in the encounter with others, and particularly Christians. And then, of course, it expanded in the encounter with Islam. And what it did for me, and I hold this close to my heart, and it was true then, 25 years ago, as it is today, that you understand yourself better in conversation with somebody else. I passionately believe that I understand myself better in conversation with you, and I think vice versa. And it's that premise that is the foundation of the Wolf Institute and the institute I established in 1998. And I think that was true then, and I believe it's still true today in all dialogues, and particularly in the interreligious dialogue.
Let us continue our analysis with a very burning question in our days, of course, related to dialogue. Why anti-Semitism again in our days? Because I suppose that you agree with me that anti-Semitism can flourish only when a dialogue between Jews and the others doesn't exist. So why anti-Semitism again? On the levels that we are perceiving in our present, because anti-Semitism never was never was erased, let us say. Humanity overcame the plague of anti-Semitism, even after the Shoah. But in the last months, in the last years, we are seeing that our anti-Semitism is growing more and more and more in a very dramatic way. Why?
Yes, it's a good and painful question. I think there are two aspects to it, in my view. I mean, there are many aspects, but I'd respond to your question in two ways. One, I'd respond in terms of what I would define as the flawed human condition. The flawed human condition, that is our propensity as human beings to stereotype and to negate and denigrate the other. I think in many ways, perhaps what Christians call original sin, I think there's an element to us which is negative, the Yetzer Hara in Jewish tradition, the wicked inclination. So there is a natural, what some may say unnatural, tendency towards denigrating others, of which anti-Semitism is one part. But of course, there's a particular, this is the second side, there is a particular aspect of anti-Semitism which is about Jews, qua Jews. And if there's one minority group that has been othered, one group that's been targeted, particularly in Western Christian lands, but not only, it is the Jew. And the reason why Jews have historically been targeted is of course, this close relationship, this intricate, this intimate relationship with Christianity and the Jewish rejection of Jesus, and it's seeped into Christian self-understanding. But you ask a slightly different question, which is why is it resurfacing after the Shoah, after the horrors of Europe in the middle of the 20th century? And to be honest, Abraham, it never went away. And we would pretend, we would deceive ourselves if we think it ever did. There is a constant battle to be had against the evil of anti-Semitism. It has not gone away. There are times it raises its head and becomes more obvious, and there are times when it is under the surface. It's always been there. Like La Peste, the book La Peste, the vermin, the hatred is there, the poison. Right now, of course, much anti-Semitism is connected with Israel, with anti-Zionism. And sometimes we Jews are a little bit too sensitive about criticism, whether it's criticism of Israel, criticism of Judaism. We're a little bit sensitive. I mean, we have a good reason to be sensitive, but we're a little bit too sensitive. Sometimes we see anti-Semitism when there isn't anti-Semitism. But we would be foolish to pretend there is no anti-Semitism. It's there. It's part of the human condition. And in a society that is so, even in a secular sense, so Christian, there is that dimension of secularized as well as religious anti-Semitism connected with the history of Western civilization. And it transfers very easily. And one further aspect, and then I'll stop, which is the element of communication. What happens on the streets of Gaza or Jerusalem or Ramallah transfers very quickly to the streets of Cambridge and Dublin and Philadelphia immediately. And the communication, the global communication, means that we react far too quickly in a society. We don't take enough time to think. We fall back on those old stereotypes. And unfortunately, anti-Semitism is one of them. It's never gone away, Abraham. Sometimes it's been dormant, you know, sometimes it's been sleeping, but it's never gone away.
A pessimist to a projection, but I agree with you. I don't
know, it's a pessimist. You know that lovely story about 3 Jews who meet every afternoon in Jerusalem for a cup of coffee? And they look around, they see all the chaos and the strife and the conflict, and they decide they're 3 pessimists, right? And one day, one of them turns around and says, I've converted. I've become an optimist. And the other 2 say, how can you be an optimist in all these difficult times? And he said, well, we're old friends. You have to accept me for who I am. And they do. And then a few minutes later, they look at this newly converted optimist and they say to him, why do you look so worried if you've become an optimist? And he said, you think it's easy to be an optimist?
Right. I will put that in another way. From one side, I am a pessimist, but I would not say that from the other side, I am an optimist. From the other side, I continue strongly maintaining my hope, my tikva, that on some time, another reality will be built. And I do consider really that this is the most important base on which we are constructing what we are constructing. I remember that in 2014, after the Pope and me, and for us it was very, I say the Pope and me because we were very, very close one to the other when he organized with the Vatican, through the Vatican, as head of the Vatican, his pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And we were very, very close because the cabinet of President Perez connected with me, and I was as a messenger between Perez and the Pope, because Perez had a great wish to receive the Pope in Israel as a president of Israel during his presidency. And so we got that. And the other point was that the wish of Perez, great wish of Perez, was to organize some kind of meeting headed by the Pope between he, Abbas, and Bartholomew. Also, he was specially invited by the Pope. And at the end, this meeting took place on the gardens in the Vatican, because that without arrogancy, but through a deep feeling in my heart, I said we. And this I worked also a lot in order to help. It was not so easy, the presence of Abbas. I worked a lot with a great person, the then ambassador of Palestine for the Holy See. Okay, we got that. But after this harsh work, a couple months after, it broke up the war between Gaza and Israel. And I wrote to the Pope, look, really, it's painful what occurs after all our efforts, after all the messages that you left there, everything that you did. Now this reality of pain, of death. So he answered to me in an email saying, but what we planted there in Israel, in Palestine, someday will flourish. Someday all the fog of the war will disappear, and our message will flourish. So it's not optimism, it's hope, and the hope is our machine. What is your view on another burning theme about the dialogue between Muslims and Jews, between Muslims and Christians, especially Catholics, after the declaration of Abu Dhabi? What is changing? Let us talk about positive things. What is changing, really?
A huge amount has changed. I like to think that I'm an optimist. I agree with you about the need for hope, but I also believe that the seeds that those of us touched, as John Palikowski, the great dialogue Catholic practitioner, talks about the angel of interfaith dialogue. I remember he used that expression with me very early on when I first met him, the angel of interfaith dialogue. And I think for those of us touched by the angel of interfaith dialogue, there are some seeds that have been planted, particularly in the encounter with Islam in recent years. We know a lot, and you've devoted much of your life to the Jewish Christian and particularly Jewish Catholic dialogue in Argentina, now in the United States, around the world, since Nostra Aetate, and each Pope since then, and now Pope Francis, has made a huge personal contribution. I say as an aside, Abraham, I was deeply, deeply touched on one of the occasions I met Pope Francis when he ended the conversation by saying, "Pray for me." And I found that so moving. And I know he uses it a lot, but I found that so moving when he said that. But the question of Islam, the Abu Dhabi process, the Marrakesh Declaration, the opening up of trade relations between Israel and some Gulf states in the last year or two, these are hopeful, positive signs. And it's all about the encounter, because the Muslims I meet in the Middle East, actually, they may not have met Jews before, but they know a bit about Judaism. In Morocco, they are aware of the history of Moroccan Jews. In Syria, in the devastation of Syria, the Syrians I know, refugees in England, tell me about Jewish neighbors, if they had or they know someone who had. This is opening up now, and we have to build on the on the fact that there is now the personal encounter. There are diaspora Muslim communities, because of the terrible refugee crisis, living in the United States, living in the Western Europe, Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis, who are meeting Jews for the first time. And this is a real opportunity for the dialogue. I feel quite optimistic. Now, there's not to say there aren't problems. The radicalization movement in Islam, and to be honest, Abraham, in Judaism, is a danger and a threat to us all. But the opening up, the encounters, the meetings, give me much hope, in your words, give me a sense of optimism for the future. In terms of the Catholic-Muslim conversation, in some ways, that's harder than the Muslim-Jewish conversation, because theologically, we're closer to Islam than Christianity. The emphasis on the oneness of God, on monotheism, the customs of ritual and practice, of food, of circumcision, of holy land. These are all natural conversations we have with our Muslim cousins. They're different conversations for Christians. The fact there are 1.6 billion Muslims and only 15 or so million Jews is similar to the relationship that 15 million Jews have with 2.2 billion Christians. But suddenly 2.2 billion Christians and 1.6 billion Muslims, that's a big encounter. That's complicated. More complicated in some ways than the encounter with Judaism. So I think that many Muslims who are coming to live in the West, in the UK, predominantly from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, are having to adapt to being minorities in a British multicultural environment. That's something we Jews have learned how to do. That's something we can help one another, passing on of one's tradition to the next generation in a minority environment. The encounter with Christianity is a bit more complicated in that sense. Now, of course, the question of Israel and Palestine makes the Muslim-Jewish conversation difficult at times. In my work in Jerusalem, in the Holy Spaces project, which is running at Al-Aqsa, of course, for Jews, the Temple Mount, is a very complicated conversation. But even there, having Christian partners from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre talk to us about how to share space is helpful. So no, I am hopeful, in your words. I am optimistic, but I recognize that there are some significant challenges to the Muslim-Jewish and Muslim-Christian conversation, but they are quite different challenges. And sometimes the bilateral conversation is helpful, but sometimes you need the third partner there. You know, it's a bit like a marriage, right? When a child comes along, everything changes. And I think we need to see that in our conversations with Muslims.
Now let us go to the institute, the very important institute that I remember very well, that you were so kind, inviting me for the meeting before the encounter, before putting the cornerstone of the, which year was that?
Oh, I think it was 2015, because Benedict had just resigned.
No. Francis began his papacy in 2013. The resignation of Benedict was in February 2013.
It was at that time. It was at that time because Cardinal Koch came, and we weren't sure whether he would come.
Yes.
Because of all the goings on in the Vatican, and he said, you know, I'm coming out of respect and because I believe in the dialogue. And he was there for, I don't know, 48 hours, and then he had to go back to Rome.
Yeah, and during these 40 hours, we had really, I remember, a deep and very, very important conversations. I remember those meetings as having received an impact of some opinions and some ideas, and what should we, in what areas should we work in the future? And okay, it's an open folder that on many senses, in many aspects, we have to continue. What is the importance of the Institute nowadays?
Well, on the one hand, the good news is that everybody I speak to takes interreligious dialogue seriously. You know, back in 1998, Abraham, when I opened the Wolf Institute, this is before 9/11, before 7/7. This is 23, 4 years ago. Nobody thought it was important. My Jewish friends thought it must be a center fighting anti-Semitism. My Christian friends thought it must be a center for the promotion of Christian mission. But it wasn't. It was about understanding the other. And nobody got it, Abraham. People didn't understand what I was trying to achieve. Now, everybody understands. Whether you're religious, not religious, everyone realizes that in today's world, you are better off trying to understand the identity of somebody else. So on the one hand, we've achieved a great deal because it's taken seriously. But the challenge we face right now, there are many, of course, but the one I'd like to mention is, what does genuine dialogue mean? What does it really mean? People sometimes think dialogue is a conversation. It's a Facebook message. It's a tweet. It's an Instagram. You know, it's nothing of the sort. It's a real opening up of oneself to the other. It's an openness, a willingness to change. It doesn't mean abandoning who I am, but it means being open to who you are. And I don't know, the person I always think of, I don't know whether you do, of course, is Martin Buber. You know, the genuine dialogue. And we have not yet achieved it. And the Wolf Institute is the preeminent institute, I like to think, in the UK, in Europe, set in the grounds of the Academy, which has a reach around the world. We're very fortunate to have built up a respect and understanding, an address book around the world, and how privileged we are to have met Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, Pope John Paul II since the Institute was established, because the faith leaders realized the importance of the dialogue. And that's true of chief rabbis, it's true of Archbishop of Canterbury. We're very fortunate to have the support of religious leaders and Muslim leaders as well now. But we still face the challenge of the genuine dialogue, because it's not easy, it's expensive. It's expensive. And that's true for my students. I say to my students when they start the academic year, that when you leave this classroom, I hope you'll be more confused than when you arrive. Because so many arrive knowing the answer before they've started the class. That's no good. So that still is a challenge, Abraham. We've come a long way. And I can give you specific examples about conflict, about dialogue, the challenge of preaching properly about the other, the challenge of, you know, here I'm talking to you in the midst of a terrible war in Europe, how we manage the situation, the Israel-Palestine conflict, issues of reconciliation, issues of forgiveness, and so on. But when it comes down to it, all of them, in my view, come down to the need to understand genuine dialogue, to know what it is to listen. Prince Hassan talks to me about the noble art of conversation, rediscovering the noble art of conversation. And I said to him, Your Royal Highness, you're right, but we also need to rediscover the noble art of listening. And of course, in Judaism, Shema, it's all about listening. And it's not passive. It's not like I sit back and listen. It's active. There's an old English word, Abraham, called hearken. Hearken. Have you come across that?
No.
Hearken is Old English for hear. Shema doesn't just mean listen. It means you've got to react to what you're listening to. It's the
exact translation for Shema is listen, but a little bit more, I would say, is understand. Understand. Shema Israel, understand Israel, our God is one. And at the end of the story of the Tower of Babel, it appears the expression that Velo Shama Ish et Tzfat Re'eu, the one couldn't hear the language of the other. What means that? They don't understand. Because to hear is lehazin, from ozen, yeah, from ears, but lishmoa, this is to listen, to understand the other. of course, Buber, and I can tell you, by the way, that Pope Francis, as myself, we like to go to the depth of things. We don't like superficial things. So when we talk at the beginning of our friendship, of our knowledge from each regarding the other, so we began slowly to open the art, but constantly one towards the other. And when we wrote the book together, very interesting, everything that you said and I understood then, because I studied Buber when I was an adolescent. In my formation in Argentina, I had a very good teacher of Buber. So the dialogue must be something very, very deep. It's as Bergoglio used to say, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the other. Empathy. It's not merely to speak. And we open the heart one through the other in such a way that when we analyze the Shoah, he said that were a lot, I am almost verbatim quoting him, were many genocides during the 20th century, but the Shoah is something different. And he explains, because they tried not only to kill the Jewish people, but also the presence of the Jewish God in the midst of humanity. And when I said, really, my deep feelings, when I opened my heart and said to him, look, I cannot understand what Pius XII did. And because I know there are many historians saying that he saved a lot of Jews through his silence, but at the same time he condemned to death many Jews through his silence. How could he maintain silence on that hour? His answer was, we have to open the archives and investigate. The true, we must know the truth. And he did that. The archives were open 6 years before the time, or something like that. The time to open according to the rules of the Vatican. So undoubtedly, this is the real dialogue. Or in the words of Buber, I vow dialogue. Yeah, and what's about Ukraine? What Ukraine? What occurs nowadays? How to be optimistic in our dark present?
I think in the face of evil, in the face of war, it's very hard, isn't it, to be optimistic? It's very hard. But you know, you are sitting 6,000 miles away from the conflict. I'm sitting 2,000 miles away from the conflict. I don't have bombs raining down on me or rockets. So if we can't provide optimism and hope, then who can?
You mentioned La Peste, and I suppose that you refer to La Peste from Camus. And going back to the idea of hope, the hope is that La Peste will be we will overcome la peste. And in the same way, this I am saying with some kind of irony, that humanity was able to overcome COVID-19 virus. We will be also, this is our hope, our candle of optimism will be able to overcome this kind of pest that is afflicting us in these days. I thank you a lot, my dear Ed, and really I appreciate a lot what you did, because we are in the same boat, in the same theme, and hopefully the world will destroy the lethal weapons, the bullets, the bombs. Thank you a lot for the institute, your institute, the books that you wrote, and the dialogue that you are doing so much in order to install in the middle of human reality. And hopefully next time that we are going to maintain a new dialogue, human reality will be absolutely different, for better, of course, than the present reality.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be part of this conversation, and I wish you every success and God's blessing, and from your lips to the Almighty's ears.